Ferguson from the Northern Conference asked to speak with the board members of our church. And so we met via Zoom. And during the meeting, he wanted to confirm the talk about Pastor Daniel being transferred and the transfer of a new pastor to our church. And of course, being board members, we were dropping subtle and not so subtle hints about who is the pastor. But I have to hand it to him, he was steadfast. He would not tell us. Matter of fact, even Larry, who is known on occasion to employ tactical stratagem to elicit information out of people, well, he failed. And so we said, okay, but he says, don't worry. He says he's going to come and he's going to make an announcement and he's going to let us know. And so he did. And so he wanted us to keep that as a secret, right? We tried, but anyway, without further ado, Pastor Jovan.
Good morning. Good morning. I wanted to come closer and use this pulpit, but I think this is kind of small, so I'll go back. Is it on? Not yet. Now? Okay. Well, how many of you have met me on Zoom? Wow. Okay, so let me introduce myself. My name is Jovan. Okay, many people have a hard time pronouncing my name, so you can pronounce any way you want. Jovan, usually Jovan. I had a professor in Jamaica who called me Ovan. And Ovan is an animal in my country. And I went and I told him, Professor, could you call me, Ovan is an animal. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry, Ovan. So he kept calling me Ovan, and I just forgave him. And any way you want to call me, and people have butchered my name, so I'm not going to get offended. I am from Serbia originally, and I have a background. I studied in England, Newport College, and then when I ran out of money, I went to Jamaica, and I spent 4 years there. Then came to U.S., L.A., spent 2 years there, working, installing floors, making money. Then I went to Andrews University, got my master's, and then I pastored in Los Angeles, Yugoslavian church, where I got my doctorate in Pasadena. And after that, I went back to my country and I taught for a number of years, came back, and started looking for a job. Being single was kind of hard to get. But here I am. And I have been pastor in Georgetown, Forest Hill, and Shingle Springs churches, and then went to Petaluma and Sebastopol. And after that, I got a call to come here, and I'm glad. And I'll see whether you're glad. And I heard you have good padlocks too, So I'm looking forward to that as well. Well, this morning I would like us to think about a subject that is very popular today. Subject that it is popular, it is philosophical. So the question that I want to pose is, what is love? Love. Now, the word love is probably the most often used word in our culture, but it is the least understood. Thousands of books have been written on the subject, songs sung, and movies made to explain explain what love is. And love has been a favorite topic of philosophers, poets, writers for generations. And different people have different definitions. But I want to say that it is very hard to define love. We can describe it, but not define it. But this morning, I want to ask a practical question. What does it mean when somebody tells you, I love you? And how does our human I love you different from God's I love you? The problem with our language is that we have only one word for love, right? I love burritos, I love soccer, I love going to movies, and I love God. All that is described with one word. Hebrews had one word as well, but Greeks had 4 words. So they had different ways of describing love. But in the New Testament, we find that love is not defined. Not defined, but it is usually described. And usually we put 2 words before love. And usually we described it like, I love you because, and I love you if. You see, if I fall in love with a girl that is lovable, pretty, rich, comes from a wealthy family, that would be wonderful, right? But if the situation changes, my love and affection towards her may change as well. When we love somebody conditionally, we tend to want them to look, act, and think the way we expect them to do so. But what does God's I love you look like? And this morning I would like us to look at that. You see, the Bible defines love in terms of an event. Love is an event. And let me illustrate that. Do you remember how the 10 Commandments begin? Here is how God introduces himself. Exodus 20, verse 1. Listen, O Israel. But notice what is not being said here. I'm your God who loves you. No, it doesn't say that. But listen, O Israel, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And that is love. Love is an event. It is God's intervention on behalf of his people. The events recorded in the Bible are not just there to illustrate what God is like, but to show us God's love in action. And this morning I want us to look at one of the examples, events recorded in the New Testament, where God shows I love you to an individual. I love you in action. And it is a well-known story about a short man and a rich man. You know who that is? Zacchaeus, right? Zacchaeus. Now, we have heard, read the story many times, and perhaps we heard many sermons on the story, Zacchaeus. But I would like us to forget about all we have heard and read, and try to go back in time and try to hear these words for the first time, and go deep and analyze and understand the way the disciples understood. Because you see, 2,000 years have elapsed, and we already have preconception ideas what this story means. Now, go back, and let's go back in time and listen to the story for the first time. But as I invite our sister to read the story, I want us to notice 3 things in the passage. Pay attention. Jesus who offers love. Second, Zacchaeus who receives love. His action, his reaction, and the reaction of the crowd. These three elements. And now we are going to hear the story from our sister.
I'll be reading from the New King James Version, and it's Luke 19, verses 1 through 9. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but he could not because of the crowd, for he was of the short stature. So he ran ahead and he climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But when they saw it, they all complained, saying, He is gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. Then Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I've taken anything from anyone, my false accusation, I restore fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. May God bless this reading.
Well, I am debating whether I should use this pulpit. Okay, I'll use it, but I'll put this. It's a very familiar story, right? So let's go back to the text and analyze and try to understand the way disciples heard, but the disciples were present there. So let's be one of the people present in the crowd. You see, by this time, Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. By the time this event happened. By this time also, he healed Bartimaeus of his blindness and turned water into wine. Now, if you can turn water into wine, you became a circus star. And Jesus had a superstar status. And the tens of thousands wanted to see him. And the text says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. And there was a man, Zacchaeus. He was a what? Chief tax collector. And that phrase is a loaded one, especially the way author puts it, Dr. Luke, the chief tax collector and rich. We'll look at this in just a bit, this phrase. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not on account of the crowd, because he was short or small of statures. So he ran ahead and climbed up in the sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. Now, the sycamore tree is a leafy tree, unlike the olive, which has very tiny leaves. So Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. But he also wanted to be hidden from the crowd. And there was a reason for him to hide. But the next thing in the text, we hear the voice, Zacchaeus, I see you in that tree. Make haste and come down, for I must stay in your house today. So he made haste and came down and received Jesus how? Joyfully. And when they saw him, they all murmured. He is going to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Now, I want to make several observations here. First, there is a very difficult thing to see in the text if we don't have a religious or theological background, because it's not in the text. In other words, there is a huge gap between Jesus calling Zacchaeus by his name and inviting him to be his guest. Make haste and come down, for I must stay at your house. And we'll come back to this later. Then Luke describes the reaction of the crowd. They all what? Murmured. I think this is the only place in the New Testament where authors say that all people murmured. We hear in some places that Pharisees murmured or Sadducees murmured. But here is they all murmured. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, the disciples, everybody was murmuring and objecting. Why? He has gone to be guest of a man who is a sinner. Now let's talk about this. Zacchaeus was not an ordinary sinner, brothers and sisters. He was a tax collector. And whenever you read about sinners in the New Testament, mentioned in the Gospels, you'll find next to the noun sinners, you'll find noun tax collectors. Why? Because tax collectors were worse than sinners. And they needed a special category. Sinners and tax collectors. Worse than ordinary sinners. And they needed a special group. But this man was not an ordinary tax collector. He was a chief tax collector. He had people working for him. He was training young tax collectors. But why that hatred? Why that hatred? In order to understand why Zacchaeus was hated so much, we need to understand the way the IRS was operating in the first century. And it's IRS time right now, right? And I don't like it. I don't know who does. You see, IRS in the first century was the vicious institution. The Romans used practice, the same practice that Persians used when they conquered their enemies. They didn't take them back to Rome and paraded them as hostages because they knew they would have to feed them. So what they did was that they left them in their own countries to do their own business. But they taxed them heavily. And taxing was very hard in those days because there was no computer, no internet, no bank account. So what the Romans needed was to have people on the inside who knew where the wealth was. So they got people like Zacchaeus, collaborators. And he climbed the ladder of success and became the chief tax collector. And Romans also had a very interesting way of collecting taxes. You see, they would decide on a certain amount they want for themselves. But they didn't care how much tax collectors actually collected from people. Sometimes the amount was 4 or 5 times higher than what actually Romans required. And all extras, tax collectors kept in their own pockets. And another thing about the tax collectors in the first century, their work protected by Roman soldiers. So no one dared to tamper with them. And yet gave the citizens right to go where the wealth is. Now, being the chief tax collector, Zacchaeus became the richest man in town, Jericho. But he was also the most despised man in Jericho because he used the privileged relationship to exploit his own people. And if there was an immoral skunk in town, Zacchaeus was. A thief, a con man, but untouchable because he was protected by Romans. The second reason the crowd murmured was that Jesus disappointed their expectations. You see, the people were upset for the basic reason. They expected Messiah, and many of them were hoping that Jesus would be that Messiah. And I want you to follow me here very closely because it's important. It's not in the Bible, but it's a background that we need to understand the text. You see, the Jews were yearning and expecting Messiah who would conquer evil and destroy the evildoers or sinners. And in the last chapter, in the last book of the book of the Bible, Old Testament, Malachi, in the last chapter, we read the following. Surely the day is coming. It will burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble. And that day that is coming will set them on fire, says the Lord Almighty. And then verse 5. See, I'll send you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, when people in the first century read these words, they automatically first applied to John. Why? Because John was like Elijah. And who was Elijah? Remember, Elijah was able to recognize and identify the 400 false prophets, expose them to the people, and then slaughter them. They expected the same from John, to identify the sinners, expose them, and then call fire from heaven to kill them. So when John began his ministry, he was acting like Elijah. He was calling out sinners like Elijah. He called Pharisees snakes, hypocrites, brood of vipers. You remember? But John says, no, I am not the Messiah. Messiah is coming after me. And now let's go back to the text. Jesus is walking down the streets of Jericho. And all of a sudden, under this sycamore tree, he looks up and says, Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, I see you up there on that tree. Zacchaeus, you cannot hide from me, Zacchaeus. And Jesus is starting very well. If he had campaign managers at this point, they would say, right on, right on. He has exposed the sinner. He knows his name. And the next thing they expected to hear from Jesus was, you snake in the tree. You have cheated. You have stolen from your own people. Come down and grovel. Bring all the books to see how much you cheated your own people. And if Jesus had said that, they would cheer up and said, yes, he's a Messiah. He exposed the sinner. The chief tax collector, he even knows his name. This man is Messiah because he fulfills the prophecy of the Messiah in the Old Testament. He knows people by their name. You see, remember when the woman came into Pharisees' dinner party and she wept her tears on Jesus' feet? The Pharisees said if he were truly a prophet, he would know what sort of woman she was. That shows that the expectations of the Messiah would be that Messiah would know who sinners are. And when Jesus called Zacchaeus by name, they all cheered and said, "Here is a Messiah. Here is a Messiah. He has exposed the sinner. Now he is going to kill him." But instead, a shock. A shock. "Zacchaeus, I see you in that tree. Come right down. I would like to spend tonight in your house." Now imagine situation. Imagine the campaign manager and all his friends are saying, no wonder they all murmured. How can Jesus ever have a following right after this? But look at what Jesus does. "I went to spend the night in your house." Jesus reveals Zacchaeus as a sinner. But instead of destroying him, he identifies with him. Then he heals him. And what was Zacchaeus' reaction? Now, it is not often that I am disappointed with the Bible. But I have to confess I am disappointed at this point. Why? Because there is not a single word about what went on between Jesus and Zacchaeus in that house. We don't know what Jesus told Zacchaeus, what Zacchaeus told. We don't know about the exchange. All we know that in few moments, Zacchaeus was to come out from the house a changed man. Completely changed man. And so we can imagine Zacchaeus coming out of the front door, addressing the large crowd, quieting down. He said, "Folks, I apologize to you. I've been cheating you for years at the toll booth. You know it, and so do I. I've been a cad, taking advantage of my position. I've gotten richer at your expense. I deeply apologize. To make it right, I'll pay back each one of you from whom I have stolen. I'll repay you back 4 times the amount I cheated you. Yes, each and every one of you. And also I'm going to give half of my goods that is left, half of my goods to the poor." Now you can imagine now the crowd was shell-shocked. And there were some cynics who couldn't believe. And one of them said, "Sure, Zacchaeus, we will believe it when we see it. The Old Testament is clear. You need to repay from what you have stole plus 20%. But you say you're going to give a 400%? What's the gimmick, Zacchaeus? What's the trick here?" Another skeptic shouted, "Did I hear that well? You're going to give half of your possession to the poor? You never cared a rip for the poor. You never dropped a penny into the alms plate. We'll believe it when we see it, Zacchaeus." And about this time, Jesus walks out, stands beside the white picketed fence, put arms around Zacchaeus, and quieted the crowd. Today, salvation has come to Zacchaeus' house. He became a true son of Abraham. I have come to seek and save the lost. Zacchaeus has been found. Now, it is worth noting here for me that Jesus used Greek word for salvation, and that is soteria. This is interesting for me because the New Testament writers usually, most of them, use another word, sozo, which means salvation from sin. Apostle Paul uses all the time, and all other authors. But Jesus used another word, soteria, which means salvation and restoration, wholeness, to health, and status in society. Notice Jesus then restores Zacchaeus as the son of Abraham. The very thing he gave away when he started working for the Romans. He gave away dignity of being a Jew. Now Jesus restores his sonship in front of everyone. And the last sentence is important. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. The lost. Brothers and sisters, to me, it sounds almost like a parable of the prodigal son. You remember the story? When the father says, put a ring back on the boy's hand. My son was dead, and he's alive now. So there was a great party at the house. Here Jesus does it. But here it's not a parable. He does it. He identifies with Zacchaeus. He saves Zacchaeus. And he restores his identity as the son of Abraham. And as a result, as we read the Gospel of Luke further, we find that Zacchaeus gained ground, and Jesus lost ground. And make no mistake, brothers and sisters, the shadow of the cross was over this event. And I have often wondered and asked the question, where did Jesus lose Judas? At which point did Jesus lose Judas? And Judas was probably a young zealot, young revolutionary, who was ready to fight for a true Messiah. Where was that Judas said, I cannot go with this Jesus anymore? I wonder if right here, Judas was one of those who murmured and said, well, you cannot trust this Jesus anymore. Because the next scene recorded in the Bible is the scene in Bethany, where he says this churlish thing about the nard. Judas was already bitter at that point with Jesus. And sometimes has caused Judas to become very, very angry with Jesus and bitter with Jesus. And it is very possible that this event triggered that, because Jesus disappointed Judas' expectations to become a Messiah. What kind of a Messiah is Jesus? Instead of destroying sinners, he eats with them. Instead of obliterating evildoers, he fellowships with them at their house. The people were expecting a Messiah who would conquer evil. They expected the defeat of evil. And by evil, they understood the Romans, occupations, and all other sinners. But no one in the first century expected that Jesus would defeat evil that he chose. And listen closely how Jesus defeated evil. This passage gives us an important clue. Jesus would defeat evil by taking it upon himself, by absorbing its anger and its power. Then he would disarm that power. And Jesus would defeat evil by identifying with sinners. Notice, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. He would identify with you and me. He would then go to the cross. And have you ever noticed after the resurrection, when Jesus came back to life, he didn't go back to Pilate, Caiaphas, and other leaders and told them, you see guys, I told you that I'm going to be back in 3 days. I'm back. Now I would do that. I would. But not Jesus. Caiaphas went right on as a high priest for another 7 or 8 years. Pilate went right there as right on as a procurator. Life went on as usual, as usual. What he did defeat, what Jesus did defeat, were the weapons they had, death and fear. And brothers and sisters, we just have seen God's love in action. This is not a parable about God's love. This is not an illustration about God's love. This is the very thing itself. And if you want to know what love is in the New Testament, all you need to do is look at Jesus. Look at Jesus touching a person with a Hansen's disease. Or Jesus talking to Nicodemus and giving him that hard blow. You must be born all over again, Nicodemus. It was Jesus talking to the rich young ruler and says, if you want to follow me, you need to pay the price. Give away anything and everything that separates you from me. It was Jesus spending the night with Zacchaeus, identifying with Zacchaeus, absorbing in himself all the tragedy of Zacchaeus' life. That was how Jesus set Zacchaeus free. And finally, brothers and sisters, as I conclude this morning, I want to point to 2 things that I learned from this passage that we can apply to our lives. The first thing I learned is that it is not only unpopular, but very risky to love the way Jesus loved. Very risky. In order to reach Zacchaeus' heart, Jesus knew he would lose most of his followers. And ultimately, that will lead him to the cross. But he did it anyway. And second thing, as a remnant, as those who believe that we have the truth, is that we need to learn from this passage that Jesus didn't put any conditions on Zacchaeus before he loved him, before he accepted him, before he went to his house and identified with himself. He did not say, you need to change your behavior first. You need to repay back all those who stole, from whom you stole. And then, only then I can accept you and restore you to the sonship of Abraham. No, Jesus loved Zacchaeus the way he was. A thief. A cad. And this is a challenge for us, a remnant church living in this area. That people will know us not by what we teach, what we believe, but how much we love. That we don't put conditions on people before accepting them. That we don't tell them you got to go and change before you're able to come to our church. We need to accept people the way we are because we have been accepted the way we were. Amen.